Thank you, Madhuri. That was a wonderful introduction to the on-the-ground kinds of problems that clinicians, both nurses and physicians, face. I'm so sorry that Marie can't be here. I have a special sympathy for the plight that she is in health-wise, given that less than 6 months ago, I myself experienced a small hemorrhagic stroke in the basal ganglia of my brain. I now know more about my brain than I ever quite wanted to know in that particular way. So if I look a little strokey, I at least can walk without a harness, which I'm very grateful for, and I am sorry that Marie can't be here. I feel particularly privileged to be able to talk with you in her honor in receiving this award, because she is my colleague both as a nurse and as a clinical ethicist. And so when I received this invitation, I knew almost immediately what I wanted to talk about. And Madhuri Goganini and I had a few summers ago one of those long Swedish sunny afternoons and evenings on the roof of a really nice restaurant, kind of dreaming before we knew about this particular conference about possibilities for future collaboration between people who are doing work and are interested in bioethics here in Sweden, and some of the things that we are interested in doing at Harvard. And then for various reasons, we didn't do anything right away. And this occasion came up, and I thought, oh, I really want to talk about this issue that I'm calling Mind the Gap. So, just have to figure out how to advance the slides. That's it. Okay. So I want to talk about 3 kinds of gaps, starting from the kind of introduction that Madhuri gave us about the clinical setting, and distinguishing between people who make decisions and people who enact the decisions, and the little gap that can sometimes go unnoticed between them. And then I want to move to talking about another kind of gap between people who give advice, and I'm specifically thinking about clinical ethics committees and ethics consultation, and the kind of analysis that those groups do or don't do. And lastly, I want to say a bit about the gap between theoria and techne, or between classroom theoretical kinds of cognitive knowledge and the in the field experience and practice of putting that knowledge to work in the real world. So those are the 3 gaps I want to talk about. Let me start here with a taking off point of, if you just think for a moment about what the most basic ethical question we might all ask in any setting, whether we're in the hospital or we're home or we just have some moral doubt about what we ought to do. That question is, what ought I to do? And so, of course, when you hear the word ought, you know right away you're at least partially in an ethics domain, because you're worrying about what your obligation or your duty is. But you could also say that question 2 different ways, depending. I mean, I couldn't say it in Swedish, so you'll have to do that part. But saying it in English, I could say it this way: what ought I to do? Where the focus is on what the right act is. But I could say it this way instead. I could say, what ought I to do? Where what you might do, what you would consider your duty, and what I would consider my duty might not always coincide. So we can talk about the act, or we can talk about the agent. And I want to take a moment to talk about the agents. Now, of course, people who make decisions are also agents. But what came to my mind when I thought about giving this talk and about the kind of work that Marie does, which is very similar to the kind of work that for 30 years I too did as the founder of the Ethics Committee and the Ethics Consult Service at Boston Children's Hospital. And it became most evident years after we had begun our Ethics Advisory Committee. And it came to me this way. We were at our monthly meeting of the committee, and one of the members from the intensive care unit, a nurse, was talking before the meeting started about some conjoined twins who were upstairs in the unit. This isn't a picture of the real twins, but they were 5-month-old thoracopagus twins. So they were joined in their upper thoracic cavity, and both the heart, several chambers of the heart were fused, and they only had a full complement of the lobes of the lungs for each. There were not enough for both. And they were scheduled for surgery the following day. And she was describing the rounds of the chief of surgery and some of the surgeons from the services who would be in the OR along with the residents as they came through the ICU. And she described the comment that the chief had made about one of these two twins being parasitical, he was speaking physiologically, on the other twin, and the need in separating the heart and the tissues as well as the lungs to salvage as much of that tissue as possible for the survival of one of the two twins. And so she was commenting that there was an expectation that the second twin would die intraoperatively, which is highly unusual. And she was talking to a woman from the OR, also a nurse, asking if this case was on the schedule. And I happened to overhear it, and the woman's answer was, yes, but we haven't heard anything about that. So this is the evening before the surgery is to happen tomorrow, and these surgeries go on for hours. And I must say, this is a master surgeon that Children's Hospital was very fortunate to have. And these twins had come from a South American country where they had first been evaluated and then come up here for reevaluation and a decision with the parents about the surgery. And the parents who were wanted both of their children to survive, but knowing that that wasn't in the advice they'd been given a possibility, were aware and had talked with their Catholic priest about the fact that only one of their twins would survive. Now, at 5 months, these children whose brains were fine are just beginning to have a social smile and interact with one another and with their parents and the nursing staff who are taking care of them. And so this kind of took over the agenda of the ethics committee discussion. And one of the things that people in the committee raised was whether or not we were going to do an ethics consult. And so my co-chair and I both responded that we don't do ethics consults unless we are asked. And so I wondered whether anyone who's been taking care of this child, so one of them was the ICU nurse, were asking for an ethics consult, and they said no. And so we had some discussion about that and decided within the committee that The OR nurse was going to go back to her office after the meeting. She was going to call the members of the team who were expected to scrub the next day, as well as the surgeon or the surgical resident who worked with him, to see whether the plan she had heard of an intraoperative death was true and whether or not the rest of the team had been notified. And if they hadn't, she was going to do that so that they would have an opportunity to make a decision, or at least plan for being there the next day. So I didn't actually hear much more about this until I was up on rounds a day later and saw the twin who had survived in the intensive care unit, and talked with various people up there, and people were, in many ways very pleased at the success of this extremely difficult surgery. That said, a couple of days later, the anesthesiologist for that case called and asked if he could talk to me. And I said, of course. And so he came to my office and he sat down and he said, I understand that you know about the case involving the conjoined twins. And he said, I've never put a patient to sleep with the knowledge that I would deliberately not recover them from the anesthesia. And it felt like killing one of those twins. So I asked him about, how the surgery had gone and what his thoughts were and why he felt so badly about it. And he said somehow he had missed the call telling him in advance. So he didn't learn until moments before he was going in. And he hadn't had an opportunity to talk with a surgeon about it. I asked him if he thought that would have made a difference. And he said no. And he said, I asked him whether he thought he should not have given anesthesia. And he said no, but he still remained troubled. And so what he asked for was to have a conversation about the ethics of handling this kind of case at our hospital, not just anesthetizing the patients and how the surgery and recovery from anesthesia proceeds, but also about the process within the team. We don't usually do retrospective consults. They are, it's kind of like Monday morning quarterbacking. It's always tempting with 2020 moral hindsight to be in a role where you are telling people something that sounds more like scolding than advice. And yet it was pretty clear, both from being on the ward and also talking to this anesthesiologist, that this was still an area that didn't happen very often, and that people felt concerned and troubled by, and therefore I think warranted more discussion. So I called the chief of surgery and went to his office to talk with him, and he said he wasn't willing to come to the ethics committee discussion. And I also did not want to have a discussion without him there. So I went to the president of the hospital and I said, I think it's important to have this discussion. And I don't think we should have the discussion without the person who's most responsible for the decisions in the case to be present. But I think it will take your indicating that it is necessary to be part of the discussion in order for it to happen. And I went in with a positive attitude, but on the other hand, I didn't really expect him to do what I was asking, but he did. So once we knew that the chief was going to come to the ethics committee meeting, we prepared for that. It was at the next monthly meeting of the ethics advisory committee. Meanwhile, we're not reviewing our cases. And I have to say, this was only 3 or 4 years into the early days of our ethics consultation process, and I was pretty nervous. But I started off the meeting by saying that this is something unusual and that we don't usually look back at past decisions to rediscuss them, and that what I didn't want people to do was to engage in, an unappreciative assessment that didn't put themselves in the spot of the people at the time trying to do the best that they could. That the starting point was trying to do the best that we could, and also thinking about why this was such an ethical dilemma where you couldn't have both twins survive without threatening the survival of both of them. We did do that with a later case, which didn't go well, but and yet, the benefit of one of the twins surviving would come at the cost of the other twin not surviving. And then we had the complications of, who makes what kinds of decisions. So, I asked, we'll call him Dr. Smith, to say a little bit about the planning for the case and how the decision had been made to choose one of the two twins to survive, which, he explained. And then some of the members of the committee began asking questions about, what alternatives had been explored, whether or not, thoracopagus twins with this kind of cardiac involvement had ever both survived, and so forth. And as the conversation took the kind of usual surgical medical turn that such conversations take, where we all immerse ourselves in the facts and hope that some fact will just kind of present itself and make it easy to see what the ethical alternative that had to this point been missed would be. It didn't go that way, of course. It never does, but when there are really serious problems. And at one point, Dr. Smith got understandably frustrated by this effort to keep digging for just the right piece of information to somehow solve this ethical quandary. And he said, I appreciate it, an extremely difficult ethical choice, and I take full responsibility, not only for the planning of the surgery, which involved many teams, but also for the ethical decision. And I had kept thinking that maybe the anesthesiologist would say something about, you realize that doing this surgery involves having to give anesthesia from which I will not recover one of these twins. Did you appreciate that problem? But he didn't say anything. And so the scrub nurse, who had not actually been in this operating room, but was a member of the ethics committee and had worked at Children's Hospital for many years, looked him right in the eye and said, "Dr. Smith, you know that if my child needed surgery, I would want you above anyone else to do it. But you cannot take responsibility for my moral behavior." You could have heard a pin drop in that room. It took my breath away. And I thought, there it is, moral agency. They're working in a team. He's made a decision for all the right reasons, surgically and medically. But his belief that he can take moral responsibility for everybody else who is in that room to enact their part of this decision doesn't actually respect the fact that they have to live with the fact that they're separating the hearts, they're giving the anesthesia, they're handing the instruments, they're closing the patient who survives, they're putting the patient who doesn't survive in a pan to go to pathology. Every single one of the people in that room, to some extent, is a moral agent. And, I knew all about moral acts and agency from years of sitting in ethical theory classrooms with great teachers. It isn't that I didn't know what a moral agent was. It's that I'd never seen it the way that scrub nurse showed me. And that's the first gap that I want to bring to your attention clinically. That is the gap between the deciders who have institutional authority and professional responsibility for making understandably hard, sometimes impossible to feel quite right about decisions, and a whole team of other people who are also involved in enacting that decision. So that's the first gap. Hopefully, the rest of the gaps won't take that long to explain. um, so, I want to say a bit about why I think this gap is so important. I know this is going to sound a little hokey, and I apologize for the little scratchy drawing at the bottom. But what I want to say about this gap is that a piece of moral agency is the kind of worry that when people stop to think about it, they don't always, but when they do, um, the challenge that it presents to a person's moral integrity. And one of the reasons for the kind of burnout and moral distress that Madhuri was talking about is this difficulty of keeping together what you're doing with your hands in enacting moral decisions, how you feel in your heart about what you're doing, and what you tell yourself in your head is the reason why it is or isn't okay to be doing it. And that connection between your hands and your heart and your head is a piece of being a whole moral agent where all those parts, in the best of times, doesn't always happen, align. And so I just want to point that piece out about the importance of recognizing and respecting the agency of our partners in moral decisions. Okay, so a bit about, well, then what do we do with a gap like this? One of the things that came out of that discussion and has come out of many other case discussions at my hospital has been anticipating the need for ethical decision when for ethical discussion when ethical decisions are going to be hard. This comes up over and over again around decisions to withdraw medically administered nutrition and hydration in pediatrics, not only in pediatrics, but we know that from the experience of a few cases that this presents a very difficult emotional, psychological, as well as ethical challenge for the people who participate in it. And so anticipating in advance that those kinds of concerns arise means that you gather the team before and talk about why at least some people think this is the right decision and see if that's persuasive, and if not, offer people an opportunity not to be in the spot where what they're doing with their hands is out of line with what they think is right. And if I could recommend one reading about this, if you're not already familiar with it, it's in English. Margaret Urban Walker is a feminist philosopher who, this is a quite old article. She's making an argument against what she calls engineering ethics and the usual takedown of American principalism. But at any rate, she's also talking about the context of how we do ethics consultation in institutions. And she talks about it architecturally as a way of keeping moral space open. And so part of what was happening in the retrospective consult for the conjoined twins and this strategy for trying to help respect the agency and integrity of the people involved in enacting ethical decisions is making space in the institution, finding the times where people can come together for conversations about hard ethical choices so that it involves them in thinking through what they're doing and why they're doing it and whether it's okay for them. Okay, so this leads me to another question. And here I'm moving to the kind of gap between advice and analysis. So you probably use the same rhetoric that we use in the United States, where although we have lots of laws, and while some things are regulated, a lot of things aren't, and certainly ethics committees are not. Research ethics committees are, and they are federally mandated. But clinical ethics committees have grown up in the United States, much as they are growing up in Sweden and other countries, through institutional decisions about how best to help staff grapple with some of the new and difficult challenges that our capacities to extend life, to know about our genes in advance, and so forth, present for patients and families and staff. So what we say about our consult service, what we say about our ethics committees, in fact, so much so that in the early days, I insisted on putting it in the name. So Children's Hospital, for example's ethics committee is called the Ethics Advisory Committee. And many, many committees, clinical ethics committees in the United States, are also called ethics advisory committees. So right away, when you look at this slide, you can think to yourself, oh, well, ethics committees don't make decisions. But ethics committees do de facto make decisions, and pretending that we don't is irresponsible in my view. When an ethics committee does good work, when it really does stay up to date about the latest thinking and literature and ways of trying to deal with ethical problems, and it gives good advice, it will be sought for that advice in a way that people very frequently follow. In fact, it's unusual if they don't. And so, on the one hand, I'm saying ethics committees are advisory. They don't really make decisions. And on the other hand, I'm saying, oh, yes, they do. They often make decisions. And what responsibilities do ethics committees have in giving advice that others will choose whether or not to take? And that's the place where I want to talk about the next gap, which is the gap between advice and analysis. Because we don't have federally mandated clinical ethics committees, and we don't have a plethora of moral philosophers and clinical ethicists trained to do this kind of work all over the country, many, many ethics committees have grown up with a system of pulling together people from multiple disciplines, oftentimes including members of the community, where a representation of different people, presumably with some different values in a society that's not entirely values homogenous, will provide the kind of forum for a healthy discussion of the values at stake and the perspectives of the various moral stakeholders, out of which a reasoned decision or recommendation might come. Over the last 20 years, I've seen many, many of these ethics committee consults. We hold a regular forum at our medical school where we talk about consults, and the extent to which those ethics committee recommendations actually have thoroughgoing analysis is bigger than I would like. There's quite a gap. Ethics committees have become better and better at being able to hold discussions and help people think things through. Sometimes they do it in a way where the people who are involved are part of the discussion with the ethics committee, and then they go away having somehow emerged at a consensus, or at least a compromise that no one speaks out against in the meeting, and so they go off and implement it. And there is no analysis. So here's an example of one that I want to talk about today. We have had this question come up several times in ethics committees at the Harvard teaching hospitals. So there are 16 of us, and so there are several clinical ethics committees, and there is a Boston in vitro fertilization center, and there are IVF centers in several of our hospitals. So in the earliest days at Children's Hospital, one of the ways this came was through the deaf community, where this was before there was prenatal, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, but at any rate, deaf parents didn't want people to assume that they wanted their child to be hearing. And we're now at a point where some deaf parents want their child to be deaf and would prefer to have an embryo, if it can be known in advance to be deaf, implanted over a potentially hearing child. This comes up again around dwarfism. Here is a case that I'm going to tell you about involving a set of parents of somewhat advanced age. I always hate that term. Having gotten pregnant myself in my late 30s and being therefore an elderly primate, I hate referring to parents as being of advanced age, but at any rate, they were in their 30s, and they had each donated gametes. So there were eggs retrieved and there was sperm from them, and it was brought together into an embryo, and they had had 2 tries of multiple embryos being implanted that had not resulted in a successful pregnancy. So they had an embryo left that they wanted to use, that they had decided to have pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and learned that the embryo had trisomy 21, which is an aneuploidy for Down syndrome. And people have different views of Down syndrome, which occurs on a continuum. But at any rate, the embryologist and the IVF physician both said that they did not feel willing to implant, and there's been various language over the last 4 or 5 years, but we've now seemed to have settled, at least temporarily, on the affected embryo. So we actually talked about this at a clinical ethics consortium, and this is my colleague Charlene in black, who was the commentator on this case, and then there were people from the in vitro fertilization service talking about this, and what they said was very similar to the actual advice that the European Society gives, which is the actually quite clear expectation that IVF physicians will not transfer affected embryos, and the reasoning in that policy here is that they share responsibility for creation with the parents, for creation of a life that might well be harmful to the embryo that becomes a child and is born, becomes a fetus and then a child. In the United States, the most recent is an article by Judith Darr, where she doesn't say that the physicians who help to create and implant the embryo and make the pregnancy possible share responsibility for the child, but she takes a kind of legal approach. She and I have both served on the ethics committees for the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and also the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, and she sees it as an attorney from the legal perspective of liability for the physicians who assist in the birth of a child who has a known genetic difference that could have been avoided. So, what we talked about in this consortium, which is a place where we discuss actual ethics consults and the process that people use for doing the consulting, giving advice, and also have a commentator, is why the ethics committee for this case had said to the IVF team that they were justified in refusing to transfer an affected embryo. And it mostly came out, not in any written consult report, but discussion, that the embryologist felt that, the reason he was in this was to make it possible for people to have children, and in particular to have children who didn't have some of the problems that could be avoided. And the IVF physician who would have done the transfer said that he felt that you never know what it's like to actually have a child with a handicap, and that while these parents might feel okay about having a baby with trisomy 21 now, if that baby had ended up on the extreme end of the continuum for babies with T21 and had very significant congenital heart and other kinds of involvement, they might be sorry and they might sue him, which are, both understandable reasons for their concern, but doesn't quite take into account some of the ethical reasoning that ought to go into thinking through this problem. Something that some people have called velvet eugenics, but also questions about justice and about who should decide and where the weight of the decision making should come down when there's a disagreement, which has implications on both sides. I could go on and on about this, and I know I shouldn't and I won't, but at any rate, there's a whole analysis that needs to go with ethics committee advice. And any ethics committee that doesn't provide some analysis for the people who will make the decision that they then live with to chew on, to think through, to see how they think about it, is not minding the gap. In fact, they are leaving that gap there. And so I'm suggesting that this is another one of the gaps, now more than just in the clinical setting making bedside ethical decisions, which happens all the time, quite apart from any ethics committees, thank God. But when there are ethics committees involved, what are the responsibilities of ethics committees to mind the gap? Okay, so lastly, I just want to make sure I still have some time. I want to say a bit about the consequences of ignoring these gaps. When we don't acknowledge the agency of members of a team who participate in enacting an ethical decision, when, as an ethics committee, we give a bottom line recommendation without a thoughtful due diligence kind of analysis, what happens is that whether we mean to or not, we're really emphasizing the virtue of obedience. We're taking the lazy person's way of exercising authority, and because of our institutional authority as a physician or a chief of surgery or an ethics committee, we rely on people's assumption that we've made the best decision for the right reasons, but we haven't given our reasons. And we haven't respected the people to whom we are giving advice, because it's their reasons that matter to them when they decide what to do. Right? And so our analysis may help to shape or persuade or not, but it has to become their own if they are fully to be agents themselves who take responsibility for the things that they do. Otherwise, what happens is people suspend their moral agency. They say, okay, the ethics committee said it was all right to withdraw the ventilator. Or the ethics committee said blah, 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 blah. And it was exactly those one-line passages in ethics rounds that I used to hear in the early days of our ethics consult service that made it so clear to me that we had to write our ethics consult reports and give them to people. First, the parents. So, we do meet with parents. We do talk with them about how they see the plight that they are in and what they think is best to do and why. And we give an account of that and hope that the rest of the team, some of whom never meet with parents, but many of them know the parents and don't talk about this. But also that we then also give an analysis that is available to people so that they can think through, why was it okay to withdraw the ventilator here and not okay to withdraw the ventilator there? Why is it okay to transfer an embryo with trisomy 21 and somehow not okay to transfer an embryo with some other disease? What is the reasoning that's different between those two cases? So those are the two costs, I think, of ignoring this gap. And then, for minding the gap, one of the things that I think ethics committees have some responsibility for doing, this goes under the rubric of identifying the moral stakeholders. And we say that all the time, but to what extent do we really take it seriously to identify the moral stakeholders? I mean, I meet with hundreds of ethics committees over the last 20 years who have never gone to see a patient or talked to a family member. I mean, what bigger stakeholder in the decision is there than the child himself or the patient himself or the parent? So at any rate, part of it is bringing the doers into the decision making and seeing whether or not there's a way of getting to consensus or shared responsibility or compromise. I would add that, recognizing that however much you may sincerely try to walk a mile in someone else's moccasins, they almost never fit. And we can't really know what someone else is facing. We can sure try, and I'm not against trying, but underneath that should be a level of modesty and humility about our inability to recognize the stakes that other people face in some of these ethical decisions, and hold out for recognition of that difference between us, that the decision really is theirs in a way it's not ours, and give them space to think through what's at stake for them and make their decision. I have also many times tried to cultivate in our ethics consult teams and in our committee a tolerance for moral dissonance. That is, we can't have our cake and eat it too, but we still keep trying. And there's no reason why we can't hold opposing moral alternatives together, despite how dissonant they are, and try to tolerate them for as long as we can so the conversation can go forth honestly with those alternatives still on the table. And that takes practice. It's not easy to hold an alternative value with respect when you don't own it yourself. But I do think we have to do that, and we have to work at trying to do it. And I think that's part of minding the gap. And then when it's not possible to get to a moral compromise, providing opportunities for people who really do conscientiously disagree, where it would be wrong for them to do what's being entertained to withdraw so that they don't have their hands and their heads in opposite places. So that might make you ask, whoops, didn't mean to do that. Oh, you don't see it on the screen, but I can't now. Since it's in Swedish, I can't tell what it says. I just want to go to that slide. Oh, I was clicking on the slide. Okay. Great. Thank you, Mikael. So, how do people learn to mind the gap? Not the way I just did it, is the point I want to make. So, I've just told you my thoughts about, I lectured at you about how to mind the gap. And the point I want to make here is that doesn't do it. So classroom learning is great. Conferences with lectures are great. I'm not opposed to them. But on the other hand, you have to do it to do it. And so I want to talk about this gap in education between theory and practice, not the way I just did in describing doing an analysis in order to explain a recommendation, but the practice of learning clinical bioethics. So here I want to talk to you about this young man. I have a better picture and I couldn't find it anywhere, so here it is. That's Matthew Riley in the middle. He was one of our Masters of Bioethics students this past year. He was originally trained as in theology. He did his MDiv at Howard University. And at the time, he was volunteering at a hospital in addition to doing his graduate work. And he got really interested in the ethics committee where he was and thought, wow, I'd like to learn more about that, and applied to our program. And we accepted him. And one of the things that we require is a capstone experience. So people have to take foundations of bioethics, they have to take clinical ethics, they have to take research ethics, they have to take health law and policy, and then they have a bunch of electives, and then they have this other requirement, which is capstone seminar and fieldwork. And the two together are, the seminar is focused on the ethics of bioethics, that is, the ethical tensions in the role of people who are identified as ethicists in institutions, whether you work in a hospital or a pharmaceutical company or on a research ethics committee for the country of Nigeria or whatever it is. If you're identified as the ethicist, what are the ethical tensions in that role? And then the other is this field work, which they also can talk about in seminar. And so Matthew said that he wanted to prepare to do clinical ethics, and he wanted to work on an ethics committee. So we had a former grad, this woman on the right, Karkajuli Krishnamurthy, Babu is her nickname, who was in our first MBE class, and she is a neurologist who had recently transferred to a for-profit health system in Boston that had gathered up a bunch of the Roman Catholic hospitals, put them together in a group that became Steward Healthcare, which is now going global. But at any rate, so Babu, in transferring from her original hospital to her new hospital to run a EEG service, a seizure service, in several hospitals, negotiated for half of her time to be in ethics and the other half to develop this new service. And so she was just beginning to work with these hospitals to make the shift between the Roman Catholic medical morals committees that they had, which didn't at the time do ethics consultation, this new service. And so I called her up and I asked her if Matthew could be her master's student, and she said yes. And so they set about doing a survey of staff in several of the clinics and hospital wards in one of the big Roman Catholic hospitals as a kind of preamble to doing in some of the rest of them. And they got some of the stuff that you said, Madhuri, of indications of moral distress and concerns about nowhere to take some of the things they saw as ethical problems, and they actually ended up taking that to their CEO and getting more funding for their ethics service. So then I said, Matthew, why don't you come to the ethics leaders group? So we put together. I better hit the right button. I think I did the same thing again. Michael, I'm so sorry. I thought I had it down, and then all of a sudden I'm hitting the wrong button. Okay, so these are the hospitals that are part of our group, and we have the chairs and co-chairs of the ethics services at each of these hospitals gather together every couple of months to talk about their programs. And so I said, Michael and Babu, would you come and present the survey that you did of your staff and the process that you followed in seeking additional funding for the ethics program? And not only that, some of the other programs, which is why we took it there, are going to use a version of that survey as a way of collecting some data in order to provide rationale for requesting additional funds for their ethics programs in other Harvard hospitals. So that's an example. We can talk about this all we want in Capstone Seminar and the kinds of ways and strategies of trying to build services and collect data and back it up with research and so forth. And you can have the experience of actually doing it, finding out where you asked the wrong question, what didn't get the data you thought it was going to get, and also presenting it in an environment where it isn't a cinch. So this is my justification for trying to bridge that divide between classroom learning and mentored, guided, supported field experiences that help people prepare to be out there in the real world instead of just graduating with that, MBE initials after their name. And so now they're an ethicist, but they've never actually done it. So I want to say just a wee bit more about that and the way we structure this program. So each time I hit that, the reason I've been doing it there, that's what I should go back to. Okay, great, thank you. So one of the ways we do this is we set up monthly ethics consortia. So we like Fridays. And every Friday, we feed anybody who will come to one of our ethics consortia. So on first Fridays, we always have the Clinical Ethics Consortium, which is where we talked about the transfer of affected embryos, for example. That's the only one that's closed. It's only open to people who are on the ethics committees in the Harvard teaching hospitals and our students and faculty. We also, though, have a research ethics consortium every second Friday. Nope, they're out of order. But at any rate, that is for members of the research ethics committees in the United States. They're called institutional review boards to talk about challenging research proposals that raised ethical issues and how they resolve them with the principal investigators. Then there's one called Health Policy and Bioethics, where we bring people in to talk about the prices that pharmaceutical companies are charging for drugs, or rationing, IVIG, or some other institutional organizational issue and how a particular ethics program dealt with it. And then lastly, we talk about organizational ethics issues. Of these 4, 3 of them have tutorials attached to them so that students who want to work with faculty on clinical ethics or research ethics or health policy attend a tutorial after each of those real life case examples. We don't yet have one for organizational ethics. I just want to tell you about one more. Ta-da! So we don't have enough Fridays in the month anymore. We've used all 4 of them, and not all of them have 5 Fridays. So we've put this one on Thursday evenings because we can't seem to get ahead of the curve. You see where that ethics vehicle is in the back? That says bioethics up there. That one in the front says science. You all recognize the road. And, the United States actually budgeted 5% of the monies that NIH devoted to research in developing the way of mapping the genome. And we still weren't ahead of the curve on some of the genetic questions that have come, ethical issues that have come up. And we haven't done that for the new brain initiative, although the one in European Union has, and has a pretty, in my view, active and effective ethics process. At any rate, if you're following the news at all, and it doesn't have to be the professional literature, you can just read in the newspaper that we're making brain organoids in petri dishes, that we can edit the genomes of babies who are born in China, and so forth. And we can't, we're hearing about the case, and then we're, swimming like mad and trying to figure out, so what are the ethical challenges and what would be some ways of thinking about what would be better, or more or less ethically justifiable ways of addressing them. So we've started this new consortium called Ethical Frontiers in Bioscience and Bioengineering, which we piloted in the spring and then began every month in September, which we will do throughout the year, bringing in the researchers who are at the front edge of doing new therapies using deep brain stimulation or genetics, or last month we had one that was specifically around tailoring a medical intervention to a particular genomic anomaly. At any rate, this is one of the ways in which we're trying to develop a partnership between bioscientists and bioengineers who are interested in ethics, and ethicists who are willing to work at learning enough of the science and engineering to be useful partners in anticipating the challenges that these new bioscientific discoveries will bring. So with that, I want to stop and allow a few minutes for questions. I am very grateful to have had the opportunity to talk with you, and I look forward to talking with some of you in more depth perhaps tomorrow, but I hope a few of the things I said were actually a little controversial. So if you have questions or if you have objections or other thoughts, I'd be happy to hear them.
Thank you so very much,
I put them all to sleep.
No, you didn't. Absolutely not. It was very interesting. And thank you, Madori. And now I want to know if anyone in the audience got any questions. Of course, they can ask you later on in this seminar. So if you are no questions? Yes, there is one question.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk. We didn't fall asleep at all. But you just one question. You described this openness for different views, etc., in the committees, and how we should be respectful, etc. And then you said one ought to also respect consensus objections within this work. Can you be more precise there. Whose conscientious objection should be respected and how far when you take these kind of decisions? Can you elaborate on that, please?
So let me see if I'm understanding you correctly. You're asking about when we're in, kind of moral deliberation and trying to figure out what are the alternatives and would they be ethically permissible? Would one or another be ethically preferable? Is something definitely wrong? And, one of the things I said was, if we can, to try to come to consensus, but not to make the consensus the objective. And then tolerance for alternative views. And are you asking, what do you do with those objections when people?
Yes, because as far as I understood, you work together in this people who are then affected, involved in the as doctors or nurses or in other roles, and then you said that trying to seek this consensus and even compromises and respect different views, and then you also said that we have to respect consensus objections within this field.
Yes.
And can you say a little more about if there are limits and in what way, what you had in mind when you had this on your in your PowerPoint?
Yeah. So I want to leave space for conscientious objection because of its necessity for preserving moral integrity for individual moral agents. But I don't want it to be lazy conscientious objection. I don't want it to be, well, I don't know, I'm just not there yet and I'm out. I want it to be thought through. Conscientious objection, I want it to actually be conscientious. I want people to have examined their conscience and think through why it doesn't feel right for them, because that's part of understanding what's wrong.
But this will lead to decisions, I suppose, these discussions and these committees. And there are some people who have to be the doers then. And I mean, I thought of a discussion we've had in Sweden that barnmorskor, midwives, yeah, thank you, because of consensus objection could refuse to participate in abortions. I mean, this is kind of a controversial question in Swedish discussion, and so I mean, this committee work is not only discussions; it also leads to actions and agency, as you have displayed here. So, can you say a little more how you deal with this controversial questions in your so to say outline here and in the view and in the way that you want to have these committees works?
Yes.
Do you get my point?
Yes, I do. And I want to acknowledge that this kind of discussion is not only difficult, but takes an awfully long time. And making institutional space for it is often a challenge itself, especially since people don't want to unearth or encourage moral objections to things. It's so much easier to paper them over, but people do actually have moral objections, and I think when they do, we have to understand what they are and modify our processes to the extent that we can. But when they can't because they think it's wrong, let's say to participate in an abortion, or I mean, we had an organizational ethics consult in which we had an organizational ethics task force for pediatric donation using circulatory death criteria, in which a whole set of ICU clinicians conscientiously objected to the entire process of offering the alternative to families whose child was not brain dead, going to have their death monitored in the operating room in order to potentially take an organ for transplantation. So when there's conscientious objection, it has consequences, and it means people won't do things they think are wrong. Sometimes they change their minds later, but often they don't. And I personally think, but obviously I'm not a CEO, and I can see why CEOs wouldn't think this, that you're a better institution for having had that conversation and having respected the staff who work there to express their conscience, but it's not institutionally efficient. It isn't. And and it takes time in ethics committees too. Sometimes you have to schedule extra meetings. Thank you for asking a question.
And a short one over there.
Thank you very much. Yes, when bringing up transferring affected embryos in PGD, you mentioned that a rationale for refusal was harm to the child. And I'm sure you're aware of the non-identity problem, and then you know what I'm going to say. How can that child be harmed by being brought into existence being death when the alternative for that child is not existing at all? I mean, I'm just interested in you refer to some European guideline.
Yes?
Yes, what are their rationale? Do you know?
I have an excerpt from it, but I didn't bring the guideline with me. I can share the excerpt with you.
Thank you.
The, the, the main rationale in the European guidelines is that the clinicians who enable the pregnancy by transferring the affected embryo share responsibility, and therefore it's justifiable for them to refuse.
I understand that, but
I don't.
okay.
They don't bring the child up. They
or-
don't pay anything for its
yeah,
upkeep.
yeah.
They don't make sure they get to the doctor on time.
I mean, I'm hearing I hear what you're saying. In that sense, I understand. But I wondered if you knew about the idea behind saying that the child is harmed by being brought into existence, unless the existence is so bad that it's not worth experiencing at all.
Yeah. So it depends in part on whether you think there are any lives not worth living.
Sure.
And,
But
all the quality of life debates have this problem. But, I think from having been in hospitals for many years, I suppose there are some things so terrible, I can think of a few, that a person might ultimately wish they had never been born.
Yes, but deafness is perhaps does not qualify.
No, I mean, I think there are problems with this analysis, LITE, as it is. It's not very hefty, and it assumes a level of responsibility that I appreciate. I mean, the embryologist who helps to connect the gametes and the in vitro fertilization physician who implants them, I have no trouble seeing that they feel responsible and might worry about the kind of children they enable to be brought into the world. Of course, there are lots of ways to worry about the responsibility you have about the children you bring into the world, whether you're a parent or an embryologist. But I don't think the rationale was there in the ethics committee discussion of this case. In fact, I think this is an insider's problem for ethics committees that are embedded in institutions where these are our colleagues and we see their point of view so much more easily than we see the point of view of infertile parents who want to have the child that came from their embryo. So which is why I think we should press so hard for more analysis, just as you're doing. And it's a very logical question. How could it be, isn't there some harm in never coming to be?
So, thank you. We have to save the questions for the concluding panel discussion. I saw you, I promise. So, thank you very much and welcome back. And